Now we'll move on to Monica interviewing historian Kaitlin on Admiral Nimitz.
Hello, I'm Monica Tostanides and I'm here with the historian of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to reveal his contributions during World War II.
Hello, I'm Kaitlin McFarland.
So, did Nimitz have a certain position before or during the war?
Well, he was chief of the Bureau of Navigation, now called Bureau of Personnel, in June 1939 and held the position through World War II.
Did his position contribute to his involvement in World War II?
Yes. While serving in Washington, Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, and President Roosevelt had picked Admiral Nimitz to be placed at Pearl Harbor. This resulted him in replacing Admiral Husband E. Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on December 25, 1941.
And were there any impacts he made as Commander-in-Chief?
His unwarranted optimism and strategic use of unharmed submarine bases and aircraft carriers gave early boosts of victories of James Doolittle's carrier-based raid on Japan and battles in the Coral Sea and at Midway Island. And he restored morale by building an aggressive combat team led by men like Admirals William Halsey and Raymond Spruance.
Is that all? I'm sure there must be more to do. Didn't he play a role in General MacArthur's island hopping traffic?
Oh yes, since he was commander of the Central Pacific area, Nimitz commanded all U.S. and Allied military forces. Bordered on the west by the Southwest Pacific area of General MacArthur's. Nimitz led the island-hopping drive toward Japan, allowing the Navy and the Marines to take Guadalcanal, Tara, and etc. And each island brought them a step closer to Japan, and each was won at a greater cost than the one before.
And can you give us a brief summary of how his victories impacted the Japanese?
Okay, well, when Nimitz forces won a strategic victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea, in May 1942, it halted Japanese efforts to capture Port Moresby, New Guinea, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and the following month they scored a decisive triumph over the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. But by the time reinforcements started arriving, Nimitz shifted to the offensive and began a campaign in the Solomon Islands in August and centered on the capture of Guadalcanal. This decision of his may have been a risky decision, but in the end all went well and a full counterattack was made in the Pacific.
Interesting. So, could you tell me how he became an admiral? Wasn't he commander-in-chief first?
Chester W. Nimitz was promoted to Fleet Admiral on December 1944 for his contribution in the sea battles, but was promoted along with Levy, King, and Halsey as five-star admirals during World War II.
Oh, I see. Is there any other additional facts you would like to add about Admiral Nimitz in World War II before we end?
Well, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the Japanese to admit defeat on board of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Fleet Admiral Nimitz signed the surrender document on behalf of the United States on September 2, 1945. Then Nimitz later in November relinquished his command at Pearl Harbor. 3 weeks later, he was sworn in as Chief of Naval Operations, where it was his job to demobilize all but a fraction of the most powerful navy in the history. The one he had built, the one that he helped build. And years later, the USS Nimitz was launched, which was a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and the world's largest warship.
Wow! Thanks so much for taking the time to answer my questions. And you've just learned about Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's contribution to World War II. Thank you so much for your time. Now back to you guys in the studio. Now let's move on to Andrielle, who will be interviewing General Dwight Eisenhower.
Hi, I'm Andrielle 2 with General Dwight Eisenhower. Mr. Eisenhower, what were you assigned at the beginning of World War II?
Well, at the beginning of the war, I was assigned to the General Staff in Washington, where I devised plans for defeating Germany and Japan. Becoming Chief of the War Plans Division, then I was soon elevated to Assistant Chief of Staff, overseeing the Operations Division under Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. Though I had never led large formations in the field, I soon impressed Marshall with my organizational and leadership skills. As a result, Marshall appointed me commander of the European Theater of Operations on June 24, 1942. This was soon followed by a promotion to my lieutenant general.
What was one of your first movements during the war?
Well, I soon was also made Supreme Allied Commander of North Africa Theater of Operations. In this role, I oversaw the Operation Torch landings in North Africa that November. As Allied troops drove Axis forces into Tunisia, my mandate was expanded east to include General Sir Bernard Montgomery, British 8th Army, which had advanced west from Egypt. Promoted to general on February 11, 1943, I led the Tunisian campaign to successful a conclusion that May. Remaining in the Mediterranean, my command was redesigned the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. Crossing to Sicily, I directed the invasion of the island in July 1943 before planning for landings in Italy.
What was done once you landed in Europe?
After landing in Italy in September 1943, I guided the initial stages of the advancement up the peninsula. In December, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was unwilling to allow Marshall to leave Washington, directed that I be made Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which would place me in charge of the planned landings in France. Confirmed in this role in February 1944, I oversaw operational control of Allied forces through SHIAF and administrative control of U.S. forces through ETOUSA. Headquartered in London, Eisenhower's post required extensive diplomatic and political skill as I endeavored to coordinate Allied efforts. Having gained experience in coping with challenging personalities while serving under MacArthur and commanding Payton and Montgomery in the Mediterranean, I was well suited to dealing with difficult Allied leaders like Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle.
What about once you got to Western Europe? What action did you and your men take there?
After extensive planning, I moved forward the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Successful, my forces broke out of the beach line in July and began driving across France. Though I clashed with Churchill over strategy, such as the British opposed Operation Dragoons and landings in southern France, I worked to balance Allied initiatives and improve Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in September. Pushing east in December, my biggest crisis of the campaign came with the opening of the Battle of Bulge on December 16th. With the German forces breaking through the Allied lines, I quickly worked to seal the breach and contain the enemy advance. Over the next month, Allied troops halted the enemy and drove them back to their original lines with heavy losses. During the fighting, I was promoted to General of the Army. Leading the final drives into Germany, I coordinated with many Soviet counterpart Marshal George Zhukov, and at times directly with Premier Joseph Stalin. Aware that Berlin would fall into the Soviet occupation zone after the war, I halted Allied troops at the Elbe River rather than suffer heavy losses to take an objective that would be the loss after the end of the fighting. With the surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, I was named military governor of the U.S. occupation zone. As governor, I worked to document Nazi atrocities, deal with food shortages, and aid refugees.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Now back to you in the studio.